welcome
to the
knowledge
nudge.
The last month is around data protection and the controls around international transfers of data, which, of course, so summer last year, European Commission came up with new standard contractual clauses to govern that, but of course that was post-Brexit, so they didn't actually apply to UK-based controllers. So people are in a bit of a quandary. Do we go with the new European standard contractual clauses? Do we stick with the old ones, which were 20 odd years out of date, but were still technically enforced in the UK? So that we've got resolution now there, but I'll be interested to hear if anybody is watching this and has already used the new mechanisms. It'll be interesting to hear about your experience. So the ICO has issued International Data Transfer Agreement, which it's made to be quite usable. You know, it's literally tick box, a lot of the tool, and that is meant to give the assurance for UK controllers sending data to countries outside UK and EU. They've also got an alternative, which is an addendum. So if you've used the standard contractual clauses, the EU ones, you can use this UK addendum to it to basically stick a union flag on it. So interesting to see that, and I'll be interested to hear from anyone who's used them in terms of how usable, how effective they are. And it's not a bus, you're waiting for buses, a couple of things come along at once. Just the week that those came into force, we had an announcement from President Biden, President von der Leyen of the European Commission, that they've got political agreement on a replacement for Privacy Shield. So just political agreement at this point. We haven't seen any details yet. So yeah, interesting. That was an interesting week in terms of international transfers of data. So we might have a mechanism in the near future which replaces Privacy Shield for transfers to the States. So stay on this channel. Don't know, has anybody heard of any clients or organisations using the new agreement yet? The new
Not yet at all. And do you think it's quite? Do you think it's a big risk for customers? Do you think there's?
I think this helps to reduce the risk, actually, because there will have been a lot of people who were kind of in limbo, trying to figure out what to do, and now they've got a definite way forward. So, do
you think there's any risk still associated with it, Frank? Because that's something that comes up with people I talk to all the time about how much is that actually going to manage risk, and would the courts actually find that is an effective mechanism? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we'll see if it's challenged, and of course, it doesn't take away from the fact that any controller has to go through their due diligence, make sure they've got reasonable assurances from anyone who's receiving data from them. But at least now we know what the documentary side of it should look like in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that we started talking about risk because Liz, I attended your VCS risk information risk management course, I think was the title of it, last week, and I found that quite informative. And I think from a small business perspective as well, one of the key highlights was, you know, how to keep up with the information security stuff. Alongside running the business, and it was quite a well turned out course for you. I mean, is there any sort of topics to you that sort of striked that you want to kind of share with people watching this today?
Good question. I mean, I think risk-based thinking perhaps still hasn't entered the fields as much as it should do, and I think that's partly down to people just not being sure about what risks there are, or in fact in some cases how they should go about managing them. And I think particularly you mentioned small businesses, I think it's particularly hard for them, you know, when you're thinking about taking on software and different packages, and you know, how do people go about assessing risk? And by and large it's likely to just be based on a reputation, and are packages being used, and are other people, and of course you've got to factor in all the other things that businesses worry about, like usability and accessibility and all of those good things as well. I think the key thing with you know, it is looking at your own processes and looking at your risk. And I think one of the key conversations we actually had on that course last week, which was really interesting, which came up again and again, which is all about reputation actually. So yeah, absolutely commercial risks, absolutely operational risk, but the bottom line is, particularly for small businesses, how is it going to impact your ability to trade in the reputational stakes? And that's something to work with. I don't think we should shy away from the fact that's going to be a motivator for lots of people. But we still ultimately the way to manage the risk is going to be the same, whether you're obviously there's going to be different things to manage when you're looking at reputation, but when you're looking at the actual where does the risk come from in terms of your information management risks, you've got to go back and identify the source of that risk. So yeah, I'm not sure that answers the question, but it's going to be different. It's going to be different priorities for different types of business. I think managing records obviously king.
Definitely, and I think working from home as well cropped up, didn't it, around sort of how people are accessing the internet. So large organisations use VPN and the secure networks. Smaller businesses were looking at, you know, they're just using at-home Wi-Fi's and kind of what things you need to put in place to kind of mitigate that as well, which I thought was quite key. And one of the things, there was cybersecurity notification centre. I'm not sure if I got the name correct. But around for a small business to, you know, sign up to that so they could get the relevant notifications to ensure that they, you know, they've got enough information, certainly with you know, the current situation at the moment. You know, information security is heightened, isn't it, cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the best sources for lots of people is going to be the NCSC, and they do provide a lot of information for all different types of businesses. They provide resources for staff, and you know what to think about for your home working, information for board members if you're a bit bigger. You know, they've got the whole kind of spectrum of, you know, these are the things that practically we need to think about. So it's a good starting point.
Yeah, definitely. And even if you're not a small business and you're a public sector, you can still sign up for those notifications, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You just need to be verified. And obviously, if you're in the information management industry, that can give you some information as well. And I think it's really interesting, Karl, because you ran a panel webinar I say last week, it was only yesterday because I was up at 2:30 a.m. in the morning to help support him. It feels like it was a few days ago. So we ran an EDRMS, the Future of EDRMS panel in Australia, and that was really well turned out. And I'll pass it over to Karl just to explain a bit more, but there was also some discussions in there, Karl, around risk, wasn't it? Information risk.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk about how the more you start to look at information risk, the more you really start having to get into cybersecurity, and the fact that those two things are really quite separate in most organisations now. But I mean, if you're not looking at cybersecurity and you're looking at information risk, I don't even really know how you start, because the two things are so tightly linked together, and that's something that's really been absent in a lot of the records management discourse in Australia. The panel itself, I mean, the whole reason that I decided to run the panel was there's a whole conversation going on in Australia at the moment. I'm not sure what it's like in the UK from a sort of systems perspective, but in Australia, you know, we've had archival legislation in every jurisdiction for, look, you know, the state record, the National Archives Act is the 70s, and you know, we've got varying ages of that legislation in different jurisdictions. But basically, every state and territory in Australia has their own version of that. And EDRMS kind of grew up in Australia because that legislation forced the creation of a couple of different software products to manage it. You know, the one that everybody kind of knows now is Content Manager or TRIM, which I'm sure you've bumped into at some point. I think Welsh government had TRIM for a long time. I think they've replaced it with Objective, but the point is, though, that there's a whole conversation going on at the moment where everybody's looking at those systems and the role they play, and they're looking at Microsoft 365, which has a lot of record keeping functionality in it. And they're trying to say, well, is it EDRMS or is it Microsoft 365? How do we go forward? And in all honesty, I think it's completely the wrong conversation. You know, the records management in Australia is largely a discipline practiced in government. And that's partly because of the acts, obviously, that create the archival institutions and the regulation. But one of the real problems with that regulation is that the archival institutions have never ever shown up to enforce it, ever. And so you get a certain amount of compliance out of that, but because it's a compliance-driven discipline and you have a regulator that doesn't turn up to enforce, what you end up with is you end up with a ceiling on how effective you can be without some really smart thinking about how to actually get the records from the business processes that are generating them and into the system. And so what people are really looking at is there's a lot of record system, and the word that gets thrown around is clunky. You know, people look at the TRIM interface, and the TRIM interface it really hasn't changed substantively in about 20 years. And then people go to SharePoint and they can kind of do all the things that they want to do, and they feel like it's really intuitive and really user friendly. And so they're trying to toss out the old record systems. I think that's completely the wrong. It's just the wrong conversation, EDRMS versus Microsoft 365. The only conversation that's actually important is how can we be effective in improving the way that our organizations capture and use the information that they've got. And EDRMS, you know, TRIM gets bashed a lot, but I've seen both the best record keeping I've ever seen and the worst record keeping I've ever seen in TRIM. You know, there are a couple of characteristics of really good records management in different agencies that I've seen. One of them is high levels of integration. You know, it's no secret that if you've got a business process that goes along like this, and then you've got somebody that you're expecting to do their record keeping as a separate business process or after the work is done, it just doesn't work. And we all know that, but getting funding for that is quite difficult when you're really going to people and saying, we need you to fund this thing so that we can, you know, satisfy an act that the regulator never turns up to regulate on. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, you know, IT are very effective in government agencies at making sure stuff gets backed up. Public servants don't generally want to delete things. And so there is almost a belief that we can just continue on, and if we're not deleting anything, we're kind of satisfying the Public Records Act, and the head of agency can sign the compliance statement every year and just roll on. And the real problem with that for me is that records management is a discipline with it has real strategic power. You know, there's a great book. It's called Seeing Like a State. And, you know, the subtext of Seeing Like a State is something along the lines of, you know, how governments aren't always effective. But if you have a look at the stories in there and how governments became effective at actually doing the things governments set out to do, it's generally a really simple story. It's generally they had a problem, they figured out how to keep records about it and have good information that was actionable, and then they were effective. You know, starts off with this discussion about scientific forestry. You know, what were they trying to do? They were trying to figure out how much money they could get out of crown forests in Scandinavia in the 1800s. How did they do that? Well, they kept good records about how many trees they had planted and when they planted them. And strangely enough, if you know the growth rate of trees, you know when you planted them, you have a record of it. All of a sudden you can predict with an amazing amount of accuracy how much money you're going to be able to get out of logging that crown forest in 50 years, 70 years. So that's the strategic power of records. You know, we figured out how to keep a record about something, and then we were effective. And I've seen this over and over again. You know, fishery management. I've got a friend of mine who's a CIO at or he was a CIO at a department of primary industries in one state in Australia, and he did this fantastic little AI project where, you know, they've got these lagoons up in Darwin Harbour, and they're full of crocodiles. And the problem is that, you know, there's a fishery in that's a fishery that needs to be managed. And obviously, you know, if you're trying to count the fish by putting a diver into the harbour, you're going to have a really bad time, because you put a diver into the harbour and they get eaten by a crocodile. And so you can't understand how many fish are actually in that fishery that you're supposed to manage. And that's a strategically important problem. If you're going to, you know, if you're going to the public and saying we need to regulate these fisheries better, but you don't know how many fish are in your fishery, that's a problem. And if you go and look at ISO 15489, you know, Section 7, appraisal, it's all about business risk. You know, how can we effectively manage business risks through records management practice? Well, the way they solved this problem was that they got a GoPro and they put it on this thing they called a bob or something like that, which basically means it's got a little stick on it and the GoPro sits on the end and it sits about a metre under the water. And then it goes across Darwin Harbour. And then they got Microsoft to come in and basically use computer vision, as in AI computer vision, to come up with a way to recognise and count the fish. And to me, that's a records management project, because we had this strategic problem we were trying to solve, which is how do we effectively manage this fishery? We needed to be able to create a record about how many fish were in the fishery before we could regulate it effectively. And then we figured out how to do that. That's a records management problem. And how we take records management from being this discipline in Australia that's really come down to how do we keep the stuff after people have created it, to how do we regain the strategic power of records management? That's the conversation that I think is important. How can we become effective in capturing all of that information? That's good, but how do we recapture the strategic power? And so I got this panel together, and honestly, it's just people I know. We got Rachel Greaves from Castle Point. We got Alyssa Blackburn from AvPoint. We got Cameron from Objective. We got Abdullah from Microfocus, who now own Trim. We got Andrew Warland, who's a well-known Microsoft 365 guy, but also has a 40-year history working in government agencies, putting EDRMS systems in. And then we got Cass Gilson from, not Gilson, Cass.
Yes.
I've forgotten Cass's surname. We got Cass from Infomotion. Cass Bissett, thank you. We got Cass Bissett from Infomotion, and it was just a really, really good discussion. Lots of interesting stuff coming out of it. A little bit of a discussion about user-centric design and how we can move things forward with that. Bit of stuff about cybersecurity and how cybersecurity really needs to come into records and information management. And we focused around 6 questions, which was, really when we talk about EDRMS as a model, what are people talking about? Because that's one of those things where people are saying the EDRMS is dead. But what actually came out of the panel discussion was that we had 6 different people and we got 6 different descriptions about what an EDRMS is. And the next question, we had a quick chat about what the future of EDRMS is, and everybody had a point of view on the future of EDRMS. In every single one of them, for some of them it was a bigger future, from some of them it was a smaller future, but it's going to be there. One of the things, I tried really hard not to talk on the panel because it was really about the other people who were there. But, for me, EDRMS systems are about objects and metadata. It's a unified object and metadata store. And if you think about that and you think about those 2 capabilities, those are capabilities that are going to have huge ongoing relevance for management of information forever, as far as I'm concerned. The best use I've ever seen of Trim is when it's used as a really robust metadata store to link metadata and objects together. Because if you're using machines to place it all the time, then you can do amazing things with metadata. I've seen agencies outsource whole business processes and those kinds of things because they designed a robust metadata scheme that enabled them to do it. Then we looked at core strengths and weaknesses of the EDRMS model, and a little bit of stuff about when the EDRMS is effective, how much of it's system versus practice. And that for me was really the crux of the discussion, because I don't work a lot in the UK, so I can't make comments about your practice in the UK. But one of my observations about practice in Australia and New Zealand over the last, sort of 6 or 7 years has been that we've really over-rotated on retention and disposition. And one of the challenges of that is that we develop classification schemes that are really focused on retention and disposition. They're not focused on the worldview of the people who we're expecting to actually use the system. And that's put a huge barrier between people who are actually trying to use records management systems and the system. And so I really wanted to have a good discussion about practice and where it's practice versus system. And, not surprisingly, the answer is always both and we had a really good discussion about that. Jackie, I mean, any particular points that spring to mind on that front? Because I'm just completely blanking on the panel.
Yeah,
There is a video of it, which we will make sure we share
yeah,
afterwards.
definitely. And I see Frank nodding along with you, so I'm sure he's got some things he's going to ask you, Karl. But one of the things to me, which I thought was really kind of useful, is that your government put out a lot of retention. So this is what like there was a long list of the things you need to apply retention to certain documents, and actually, you know, in terms of Microsoft, you're all looking at big bucket retention because there's no way you can facilitate that within the Microsoft system. And there was a real disconnect between what the government was kind of putting out and also kind of what practice is to actually achieve what you need to kind of achieve.
Look, GDS 40 in South Australia, which is the local government, you know, administrative retention schedule. I can't remember whether it's 589 or 641 different retention classifications, but we're trying to build a system with, you know, I mean, who cares, you know, let's say it's 100, you know, you're trying to build a system with 100 different classification, you know, different classifications. That's a complicated exercise. By the time you get to 600, I mean, we all know that you're wasting your time with that. And there was a bit of a discussion about some stuff that Queensland State Archives are doing, which is, you know, they're trying to get that, they're working on getting that retention schedule idea down to, you know, sort of short, medium and long term and then permanent. And, you know, sort of bringing it down to a couple of retention classes, which to me is just, it's the only sensible way that you can move forward. I mean, there's been a massive discussion in every tier of government about rolling up retention schedules so that, you know, we do exactly that. You know, yes, we have all of these retention classes, but, you know, if we've got 50 different classes that are 7 years, well, let's just have one class and call that a 7-year retention class, which is sensible until you go and have a look at the way classification schemes are designed in lots of organisations, which is really they're just the retention schedule rolled out as something that users see, which has the results that you would predict it having, which are not good ones.
Yeah. And Frank and Liz, what's your thoughts on that in terms of the UK?
Some really interesting thoughts there, and I was nodding vigorously when you were talking about it being the wrong question, EDRM or 365. But I think what will happen in reality is that a lot of organisations will move away from a traditional EDRM just because of cost, just because of budget. So rather than, because the big problem with a lot of those systems is they haven't been used properly. So Karl, you described relying on behaviours which just aren't there, rather than integrating into workflows and business processes. The other big issue is they're often used like an enterprise content management system, and they're not. You know, that's not what they are. So people are comparing it to an ECM environment and finding the classic records management system to be wanting. And of course it is, because it's not an ECM, but that's how they're trying to use it. But I think what will drive it for a lot of organisations is, okay, we're already paying 365 licenses, and that gives us SharePoint Online and Teams and things like that, and therefore we'll move away from the EDRM, rather than what I think you're hinting towards is have a look at what you need to do, use ERDM for what it's good at, but don't apply it just across the board. And that's the classic issue, is organisations think, how do we deal with our records? We stick them in here. And that's their solution for everything. And they're not thinking through usability. They're not thinking through the record keeping requirements that could be met in other line of business systems, in the ledger systems and their CRMs, and see records management as be a sort of federated approach. We make sure we're keeping our records in appropriate systems. No, we've got an ERDM, we shoehorn everything in there. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting few years.
And it's, I mean, what you've just said there is, I mean, for me, that's absolutely spot on. One of the things that archival legislation and regulation has been incredibly effective at, though, in Australia, is entrenching the EDRMS, because there are lots of organisations that I'm talking to at the moment where they're saying we just want to use SharePoint, and that's actually been the traditional sort of IT versus records management conversation for the last 10 years has been, oh, we'll just use SharePoint. I remember having a conversation with Tony Walls, who owns Objective Corporation, at one point when I really started to run into, I was when I was at Objective, I was working on a collaboration product there called Objective Connect, and I was running into really serious competition with OneDrive because people were looking at, the ability to just sort of send document links in OneDrive and saying, well, we've got that, why do we need this other thing? And I was talking to Tony about it, and Tony was saying, yeah, but look, 20 years ago, everybody came to us, and no, it wasn't 20 years ago. This conversation was probably 2017. He said, just after SharePoint came out, which I think was 2000-ish, he said, everyone came to us and said, you guys are going to be out of business in a couple of years. And you kind of fast forward 20 years, and Objective Corporation is now a $1+ billion corporation. Its revenue seems to be going like this. It seems to be becoming more and more successful. I mean, archival legislation and regulation has been incredibly effective at entrenching those systems. There was an agency that came to us for some training last year, and the person who was at that agency, did our records management course, went away and wrote his guidance on Microsoft 365 and just said, look, we can do a lot of interesting stuff with it. This is to the cliff notes. We can do a lot of interesting stuff with it, but it just doesn't comply with National Archives regulation, and so we can't use it as a core records management system. And that's how records management's been done in government in Australia for 20 years. And that's without even talking about structured data systems and business process management system, which, as far as records management teams are concerned, they're not general. And this is a big generalization, but still I think an accurate one. Those systems, they're not record systems. And it was actually interesting because I think that one of the first things that it was either Alyssa or Rachel said on the panel yesterday was, all systems are EDRMS now. And I thought that was for me, that's correct. What we're actually arguing over is we're arguing over quality. But I think that's one of the byproducts of legislation in Australia has been that we don't think about the quality of records so much. The quality standard is here, and it's this metadata standard, and if it's not at this metadata standard, it's not a record. And we don't talk about the rest, even though we've got databases sitting underneath business systems that every public servant in Australia is working on every single day of the week. They're using to manage their processes, their records, really critical services. But we don't think about them as record systems, which is just crazy. But I think that's one of the real disconnects between the legislative environment and the operating environment. And I think it's being reconciled at the moment. The trend in the last sort of 5 or 6 years for archival institutions has been to roll back metadata standards, roll back things like approval processes for EDRMS. South Australia, where I'm from, we had SARCMs, South Australian Record Keeping Metadata Standards, the biggest, most prescriptive metadata standard in the world by a mile. It makes Dublin Core look pretty pedestrian. You also had to have your record system approved. So you'd go to market and you'd get this record system, and then you had to implement it, and state records would actually come and approve your record system as a record system. But SARCMs is gone. You don't approve record systems anymore. And now records management in South Australia is basically 6 principles, and they're nice pragmatic principles about managing good information and those sorts of things, because everyone's realized that 20 years ago in Australia, all record keeping was done by, or all records management was done by professionals. Here is the file, thank you, we're now going to manage it for you. Now it's done by non-professionals, and there's still a lot of practice that hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And
it takes us full circle back to risk.
It does.
Because I think there's that danger that the sort of using an EDRM makes you think in a slightly binary way. Is this a record? Is it not? If it's a record, boom, it gets the full EDRM treatment. Whereas actually, there's lots of stuff. There's lots of content in our organisations which yeah, strictly speaking, it's a record, but it's not a record that is ever likely to be challenged in a court. It's not very unlikely to be called up in a public inquiry. It's very unlikely even to be audited. So the risks for that content is much lower than for some other things. So yeah, I think one of the things organisations are going to have to get used to is a more nuanced and a more layered approach, rather than boom, we treat records this way, we treat other stuff that way, and look at it process by process, function by function.
And National Archives here they've implemented something like that recently. So, you know, they've gone from, one of the quirks of legislation here is that everything a public servant creates in the transaction of their duty is a record and must be kept. That's been part of every piece of legislation forever. National Archives, though, have recently introduced a core records classification and basically said that we expect core records to be managed to X standard, and then, you know, there's a descending sort of risk-based idea after that. But it's really stopped people making those pragmatic decisions over the years. And I've also, here's an idea that has struck me recently as well. I think there's a real problem with the way records management value information versus how people value information. And the case in point is that, you know, if we look at a retention schedule as a valuation tool, well, permanent retention is obviously the most valuable thing in the organisation. But if you look at the thing that's going to make the biggest difference to people on a day-to-day basis, it's stuff we'd class as ephemera. The to-do list that somebody writes when they go into the office every morning is probably the most valuable record for them that they'll create in the entire day. And if you take it away from them, they'll be completely confused and discombobulated and really they'll just really struggle with the rest of the day. And it's just interesting because I started to think about that idea, and what we would class as ephemera is often the current state of the organisation. And it's interesting because if you think about that idea of ephemera being the current state of the organisation, and you look at why accounting as a record-keeping profession has gone from strength to strength, it's because accounting has really focused on helping an organisation understand where it is so that it knows what it can do next. It doesn't do anything looking backwards, or at least not much looking backwards. It's all about where are we now financially so that we can move forward. And if you go and have a look at the history of financial record keeping, you know, you'll get back to the 1500s, and, you know, Luca Pacioli wrote a treatise about the Venetian way, which was, you know, what became double entry accounting. It was all before that. People who were in business had no idea whether they had money or didn't have money. They had no way of forecasting accurately whether, you know, if I sell this stuff, I'm going to have made a profit, or if, you know, if I buy this thing, will I be insolvent? They really had no idea how much money they had from day to day. They'd have these running tallies, but they didn't have anything we recognise as a ledger. You know, Luca Pacioli comes along and writes this treatise, and it gets adopted all over the world. And the accounting profession goes from strength to strength to strength, and now it's probably the biggest profession in the world. But so it got me thinking about ephemera, because ephemera is the current state. It's how we know where we are a lot of the time. It's the email, it's the workflow email, it's the to-do list, it's those sorts of things. This might be an idea that's completely wrong and backwards, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. Go on, Liz.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I do kind of like your thinking. I can absolutely understand where that thinking comes from, although I think maybe there is another dimension in that. It is that, to me, it's certainly in my experience, those types of records are things that could be relatively easily recreated. You know, so if all my to-do list had disappeared, I would be lost, but then I would be able to set about relatively quickly, probably putting it back together. Would I put it together the same way? Probably not. So I think that's really interesting, because I was going to pick up on something you said earlier as well about the practices, because one of the things, to me, I come to kind of records management with a slightly different background, probably to most people. But one thing I'm really interested in is, you know, we sometimes don't look at the end requirement, or quite often what are we actually trying to achieve, And yeah, we can get systems to do that, but if we don't get systems to do it, then people have to do it. There's actually nothing else. And quite often I'll have conversations with people and they'll look at systems and it's like, yeah, but you still need to look at the other bit. You still need to look at what are people going to do to actually get to your end goal. And if you can get a system that does absolutely everything, that's when the cost comes in, which is what Frank was talking about. And that's certainly my experience around SharePoint. And a lot of those discussions are, yeah, we'll do almost everything, and it can do everything if you want to, spend the money. But the bottom line is, do you? And also, of course, I think the big issue again is risk-based is future-proofing what you implement. And increasingly, that's certainly working with 365. I think that's a huge challenge.
And I think the big thing, and just sort of in summary of that, there was two things that I think we've been talking about in the UK as well. Is it still records management, information governance, information management? So there's like, what does that look like structurally within organisations as well? Where does it sit? So there was a real conversation around all of that, and I think we still have that in the UK, don't we? Of Frank and Liz, you're both nodding at me, so feel me kind of what your customers are saying, but we're definitely kind of seeing the transition more into the information management. And there's also Alyssa Blackburn throughout on her soapbox about record and the usage of the word record, which I think is also quite important, because that is evolving as well, and I'm seeing that a bit more in the UK. And like, what are you guys thinking, Frank and Liz?
I think I kind of come from the approach, which doesn't always work. I think every organization is going to be different, but I think you have to start from a point of, do these people in this organization actually even need to know, or can we embed in the process for systems to basically siphon off what's a record and what's information? And I think it really does depend on the business process, and exactly as Karl said already, how important is that record? And I think Frank made some very similar points. So those processes are going to be very different. Where they're absolutely essential records, then yes, absolutely, people need to understand the risk of what's going wrong, of something going wrong, sorry. But when you've got the other end of the spectrum, which probably you're creating things that, yes, they're technically a record people are never going to need to look at again, do those people really need the same understanding of record keeping, and do we need the systems to do the same thing? And I just don't think we get that right. And if we did get that right, it would be so much more efficient and effective for organizations as a whole. But instead we kind of very tempted to do the broad brush because it looks easier. But in reality, how effective is it? And that comes back to all of Karl's points.
Yeah, because I think, and Karl, you mentioned this, I think we have been undermined by legislators who say, oh yeah, records is everything. No, it's not. It's really not. And we'll be kind of painted into a corner by that. And I think the concept of record is still really useful for an organisation to make its decisions about what do we need to keep to manage risk, to deal with compliance, to meet our governance requirements. But I absolutely agree with Liz. For most of our colleagues, it doesn't matter. And it becomes a kind of, if we introduce the concept, it goes back to, well, what do you mean records? This record's that record? And you could just talk that round in circles for years. So if we get to the point where we've got the business processes and a little bit of guidance to colleagues around behaviours, we keep this stuff, we put it there, we call it that. That's really all they need to know. And if our processes are well designed, that should take care of everything else. Meanwhile, back in planet Earth.
Yes.
Look, the kind of definition wars, in records management happened. But I think what I've seen is a lot of people shell-shocked from that. I actually think it's super important for organisations to define a record and have a shared description. I don't care what the description is. Personally, I'm a representationalist. I believe that, a record is a representation of something that happened. Whether that thing is important enough to keep hanging on to the record over a long period of time, that's the decision you have to make. Other people think differently. It gets to this level and it's a record, millimetre below, not a record, whatever. But I think the awareness of a record as a special class of information, I actually think that's a really important concept, and I think one of the, it's different obviously in different organisations, but in some organisations, having employees who can make sense of whether something is a record or not, I think that's important. And I think if we say just follow this process, there's a real temptation to do that, particularly in government, because they're very bureaucratic organisations. But the rest of the world has kind of woken up to the fact that bureaucracies, they're great in some situations, but most of the time they have all kinds of problems and don't generally work that well. And I think that in records management, I think that by taking that approach and saying, well, you just put it here and your job's done, we rob people of the ability to make sense of it. And then the problem with that too is that if we then don't come along, if we don't police that, so, we tell them to just do the simple thing and just put it there. Well, one day they don't put it there and nothing happens. And so then they go, well, now I've just got all of this extra productivity because I'm not putting the thing there anymore. And trying to give them an awareness of why it's important, I think that's really important. And I actually think that's an area where, one of my early experiences in records management, I was at the RIMPA conference, which is the Records and Information Management Professionals. It's kind of like the IRMS, but in Australia. And I was at the New South Wales Branch Council meeting, and I sat down with a bunch of very senior people in the records management field, and I said, I think we need to start talking about records again. I think we need to be records managers because this discipline is important. It has strategic power that information management, there's a different kind of gravitas between the two things for me. And honestly, saying to them that I think you need to be records managers again, I think the temperature in the room actually dropped about 15 degrees. It got very cold very, very quickly. And there were a number of people at the table who were quite offended by that because of the connotations that records management has as being paper-based and those sorts of things. But I think in an effort to run away from that, I think we've stopped talking about it, and I just think it's something that's actually really important to understand as an organisation. And actually, I've seen, and in the interim, I have a really good friend of mine whose whole program was derailed because she went into this very large multinational to stand up a records program, and wrote all of a policy, got procedures together, was going out to market for a system, and the senior executive supporting the program stood up in a meeting and said, oh, emails aren't records. And then another senior stakeholder, oh, records are just the paper. And, this friend of mine and I had the discussion in the past about whether you talk about records or not. And she falls on the side of you don't talk about records. And that's what happens when you don't talk about records and you're brought in to run a records management program. You get derailed because you've got your whole organisation walking around with different ideas about what's important in their heads. And I think that's a huge problem, that shared meaning. If you want to say that, records are only the output of, the final output of this process and they're the only records we have in the organisation, okay. There'll be a little bit of retraining when someone goes to the next organisation, but shared context, I think, is super important. It's a sense-making tool. And when we rob people of the ability to make sense of things, bad stuff happens, in my experience. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I agree, but I think in terms of representation of those concepts for most of our frontline colleagues, it's not so much a discussion of what's a record, it's a discussion of what do we keep? Yeah, that's the core conversation, and that's what. So I think at the corporate policy and strategy level, we need to define the records. I think for day-to-day colleagues in the front line, that usually boils down to what do we keep? Yeah. And yeah. I absolutely agree with you. That has to be articulated. It has to be explored, not necessarily corporately. That can be at team level, at function level, to get consistency across people doing this job. What do we keep? And that's the key question for them. Recordsness, I fascinates me, but it doesn't fascinate 99.9% of the population and of the workforce.
And a
The,
lot,
the, the
lot
thing
of
for me
that,
is always the edge cases. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jackie. It's always the edge cases, you know. What do we keep? Well, you told me to keep those 10 things, and so I kept those 10 things. But then what about the edge cases? You know, like normally there isn't a separate email to talk about this other thing as part of that process, but in this case there was. And then if you don't give people that sense making ability, how do they resolve the edge cases? And I find they tend to resolve them one way or another. They keep everything, or they religiously do what you've told them to do, which also produces a bad result. And again, that's a risk-based decision. And that's what makes all of this really hard. It's all risk-based. It's all about probabilities, and it's just hard.
Yeah.
And that's why we all get paid for it. 'Cause
Yeah,
it's hard.
and I think, Frank, you've talked about sort of stuff you can keep. Obviously, you can automate as well, can't you? So you can, you know, enforce that from an end user perspective. And Frank, we've had lots of conversation about organisation just having too much information. You know, we're talking about legacy systems and all that information inside there. So I think it's really. Go on, Frank. You look like you're going to say something.
I was just going to say that is the risk that's often ignored.
Yeah.
So if people are thinking about risk, they're thinking, oh, what's the risk we don't have this? What's the risk you've got 10 times as much stuff as you actually need?
Yep. Yep.
In terms
And you
of
can't find
cost and
anything.
compliance, and it's
Yep.
buried.
Absolutely. And I think in summary, and just linking, so we LTD ran a webinar with Joanne Klein, and one of the big things, so that was about kind of working with IT and information managers, and I'm going to call them information managers, so I think, you know, we sit under information management umbrella. Is that where do they sit inside organisations? Now, when I was in the NHS, I was, you know, kindly enough sitting within IT, so I could see what was upcoming. I could get involved in conversations early at the sort of the outset as well. And information management sits very differently in every single organisation. So some sits in silo. Records management doesn't sit, you know, can sit in silo from information governance. You can have information governance outside IT, but just running from that webinar, people are moving information management inside IT in IT. I'm seeing that. Liz, Frank, are you seeing that as well?
I think it's
They're trying, and they're not always understanding it.
Okay, cool.
Is the issue. So sorry, Liz, I talked over you there.
No, that's okay. I was struggling to. I think there's a lot of conversations being had in that domain. I guess the majority of my experience actually is with outsourced IT departments, which has kind of not halted that, but it has certainly slowed that kind of transition. But certainly I think there is a huge contribution that IT should be making to information governance, but it is where is the motivation? You know, what is actually leading that, and what, again, it comes back to what are our organizational objectives, what are our shared understandings of all of these things, and how does each element contribute? And absolutely fantastic if you can get all of those things moving in one direction. The challenge is doing it, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. What happens more often than not is that one side or another is playing catch up. So information governance or records management come up with various policies, and when we go to our ICT colleagues and they go, that's unimplementable, or IT are running with it and we're running and say, don't do that, you can't do that. So it's back to making sure everybody who should be around the table is around the table at the earliest opportunity, which is an obvious thing to say, but it's often missed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Really, really grateful.